the crisis that nearly broke the White House. In the heart of the White House, behind the polished doors and the grand halls, a crisis was quietly building, a situation so dire, so unexpected, that would threaten not only the president's legacy, but the very fabric of the nation's stability. It was a moment of leadership unlike any the country had seen before, and it all started with a single piece of intelligence, a report that arrived in the early hours of quiet morning, when the weight of the world was still asleep. To understand why this crisis matters, we need to explore the delicate balance of power, secrecy, and trust that exists within the walls of the White House. When national security is at stake, when the future of millions hangs in the balance, the stakes are raised higher than ever. Decisions made in these moments are often invisible to the public, quietly unfolding in the background while the country goes about its daily business. But the consequences are felt everywhere. The report that landed on the president's desk that morning was unexpected. It didn't come with fanfare or urgency. It wasn't labeled as a priority. It seemed at first like just another routine update. But as the president skimmed through the pages, the gravity of the situation became clear. A foreign power, with which the United States had an increasingly fragile relationship, had crossed a threshold. They had taken actions that could jeopardize not just diplomatic relations, but national security itself. The president's immediate reaction was measured, calm, yet brimming with urgency. This was not a time for rash decisions or quick fixes. The intelligence pointed to a critical development that could not be ignored, yet the full scope of the situation was still unfolding. The president needed more answers, more clarity, and most importantly, time to make the right decision. Advisors rushed into the room, their faces a mix of concern and determination. The security team was on high alert, while military advisors began preparing contingency plans. But behind the scenes, there was something more than just the fear of an external threat. There was a growing sense of unease among the president's closest allies, a feeling that perhaps, for the first time, the nation was on the precipice of something far worse than anyone had imagined. The president, surrounded by top advisors and experts, began the task of understanding what was happening and how to respond. It was not just about managing a crisis. It was about defining the future of the country. The world was watching, but there was something deeper at stake: trust in the White House itself. The president had to ask the most difficult question of all. Could they navigate this crisis without losing the support of the American people? With a deep breath, the president called for an emergency meeting with the national security team. As the doors to the Situation Room closed, the weight of the situation became even clearer. What they were about to face was not just a military or diplomatic challenge. It was a test of leadership in its purest form. Every decision made in that room, every word spoken, would reverberate far beyond the walls of the White House. The crisis had begun, but the president, though shaken, was determined to steer the nation through the storm. This was a moment of reckoning, and the president knew that the outcome of this crisis would define their legacy forever. So, what do you think? Was this a defining test of leadership for the president, or was it a crisis that exposed their weaknesses in ways they couldn't overcome? The Situation Room was tense. Advisors sat around the table, their faces grim as the president entered and took their seat. It was a scene that had played out many times before, but this time felt different. The weight of the moment was palpable. Every person in that room understood that the decisions made here, in these next few hours, would ripple out to affect millions of lives, perhaps even change the course of history. The president opened the meeting without a word, a signal that the time for pleasantries had passed. They immediately addressed the issue at hand: the foreign powers' actions, the potential risks, and the immediate threat to national security. But as the briefing unfolded, it became clear that the situation was more complex than anyone had anticipated. This was not just a direct threat. It was part of a broader, more subtle campaign to destabilize the region, one that involved layers of diplomacy, military posturing, and covert operations. The president listened carefully, processing the information as it came. Every advisor had a different perspective, a different piece of the puzzle. Military advisors focused on tactical responses, options for military action should the situation escalate. Diplomatic experts outlined potential responses, focusing on how to manage the crisis without provoking further tension. Intelligence officials discussed the accuracy of the information they had gathered, weighing the likelihood of miscalculation. Everyone agreed that the situation required swift, decisive action, but no one could agree on what that action should be. The president's mind raced through the possibilities. A military strike could send the wrong message, risking broader conflict. Diplomacy might be the key, but with trust already fragile, it would take weeks, maybe months, to achieve any kind of meaningful progress. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground was rapidly deteriorating. The clock was ticking, and every minute of hesitation seemed to be making the problem worse. A long pause fell over the room as the president gathered their thoughts. They had been through countless crises, each one unique, but this felt different. It wasn't just the external threat that was weighing heavily on them. It was the internal struggle. How could they balance the immediate needs of national security with the long-term implications of their actions? How could they keep the country safe without compromising the very values they had sworn to protect? After what seemed like an eternity, the president stood, signaling the end of the discussion. "We can't afford to wait," they said, their voice steady but firm. "We need to act decisively, but we need to do it carefully. Our response must be strategic, not just reactive. We'll move forward with a multi-pronged approach. Diplomatic channels first, but with clear contingencies in place if things escalate. We'll send a message, but we'll do it in a way that preserves our position and minimizes unnecessary escalation." The room exhaled in collective relief. The president had made the call. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it wasn't without risk, but it was a decision that balanced immediate action with long-term strategy. The response was firm but measured, clear but flexible. The president had done what was necessary, even though the full consequences of the decision were still unknown. The team went to work immediately. Diplomatic channels were activated, military options were reviewed, and a comprehensive communication plan was put into place. The president's decision would not be without its critics, but it was made in the belief that leadership sometimes requires taking bold, difficult steps. It was a decision that would carry consequences, but one that was guided by a clear sense of responsibility. As the president left the Situation Room, they took a moment to reflect. Leadership was not just about acting when the world was watching. It was about knowing when to act when the world was not. The days ahead would be challenging, but the president knew they had taken the first step toward navigating the crisis with a steady hand. So, what do you think? Did the president's response strike the right balance, or did they risk too much by acting too quickly? The days following the president's decision were a whirlwind of activity. The initial relief that came from having made a choice gave way to the intense work of managing the consequences. The world was watching, and the response of the president's actions was swift, some supportive, others critical, and the rest uncertain of where this decision would lead. Diplomatic channels, as the president had directed, were immediately opened. Messages were sent to key allies, briefings were held with foreign leaders, and the administration worked to secure a unified front in dealing with a foreign power. But while diplomacy was the first line of defense, the president knew that they couldn't ignore the military aspect of the situation. Options were prepared, contingencies discussed, and a careful balance was maintained, ensuring that the military would be ready, but not deployed unless absolutely necessary. Back at home, the president's decision began to play out on the political stage. Supporters of the administration praised the swift and strategic action, pointing out the careful balance between military readiness and diplomatic efforts. They argued that the president had shown the kind of leadership the nation needed, one that was willing to confront a dangerous situation head-on, but with an eye toward long-term stability. However, critics were not far behind. Opposition parties seized the opportunity to question the president's handling of the crisis. They argued that while the decision was swift, it lacked the nuance required for such a complex issue. Some feared that the president's actions had been too aggressive, too soon. Others wondered whether the administration had underestimated the potential backlash, both at home and abroad. The political ramifications of the decision were beginning to unfold, and it was clear that the president would not escape unscathed. In the White House, behind closed doors, the president's team remained focused on the bigger picture. The immediate threats were being addressed, but there was a deeper concern: the long-term consequences of a decision. Would the world see the president's actions as a sign of strength, or would they be viewed as a risky gamble? The administration's communication strategy was adjusted to ensure that the narrative would reflect the careful thought behind the decision. Every word, Every speech, every press release was crafted to reinforce the idea that the president's leadership was measured, not reckless. The real test, however, was not just in how the nation and the world reacted to the president's actions. It was in the quiet moments when the president had to ask themselves whether they had made the right choice. It was in the long hours spent in meetings with advisors, poring over intelligence, recalibrating their strategy. The president knew that no decision was without its price. The risk of escalating the situation still loomed, and every decision from here on out will be weighed against the potential fallout. Days turned into weeks, and while tensions remained high, there were signs that the president's strategy was working. Diplomatic efforts began to show progress, with conversations happening that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks before. On the military front, the readiness posture had been effective in deterring further escalation. The world was watching, and the president's leadership was beginning to earn recognition for its calm and strategic handling of the crisis. Internally, the president's approval ratings started climbing again, though they remained divided. Some viewed the situation as a success, a testament to the president's ability to act when necessary. Others continued to question whether the balance had been struck perfectly. Still, what became clear was that the president's ability to act decisively and then shift into diplomacy had averted immediate disaster, and that in itself was a form of leadership that resonated with many. But the final question remained: had the president's decision truly safeguarded the nation, or had it been a momentary success, one that would be overshadowed by new challenges in the future? Only time would tell. What was undeniable, however, was the lasting impact of this decision on the president's leadership legacy. The crisis had forced the White House to act in ways that no one could have predicted, and the consequences of that action would shape the course of the administration for years to come. So, what do you think? Did the president's leadership truly handle the crisis, or was this merely a temporary solution that will be tested by future challenges? As time passed and the initial tensions began to ease, the true impact of the president's decision started to reveal itself more clearly. The crisis, though not fully resolved, had been managed with a level of leadership that not only calmed immediate fears, but set the stage for long-term stability. Yet, as the situation unfolded, it became evident that the legacy of this decision would not be defined solely by the resolution of the crisis. It would be shaped by how the president handled the aftermath and how they responded to the evolving landscape of both domestic and international relations. The international community, though initially wary of the swift actions taken, began to acknowledge the president's calculated approach. Diplomacy, when it was most needed, had borne fruit. What could have been an irreparable rupture in relations had instead turned into a series of productive dialogues and agreements. Allies, initially uncertain, now stood firm alongside the United States, recognizing that the president had steered the nation through a potential storm with a steady hand. While challenges remained, the groundwork had been laid for a new era of cooperation, even in the face of previous tensions. At home, the public's reaction began to shift. Initially split between praise and criticism, the American people started to see the results of the president's actions. While there were still those who questioned the wisdom of the decision, the president's willingness to face the crisis head-on, to manage the immediate threats while keeping long-term goals in sight, resonated with many. Political opponents softened their stance as the situation stabilized, acknowledging the president's determination in the face of overwhelming odds. For the president, the most rewarding aspect was not the recognition or the political gain. It was the understanding that, in that moment of uncertainty, they had made the right call. The decision was not about winning approval in the short term. It was about doing what was necessary to secure the nation's future. And as the months passed, it became clear that the world had seen the president's leadership as resolute and strategic, even if the road had not been entirely smooth. The challenges, however, were far from over. The president knew that the true test would be how the country moved forward in the wake of the crisis. The moment of decision had passed, but the aftermath would shape the future. New policies were introduced to solidify the gains made during the crisis, and the administration began working on long-term reforms that would prevent similar situations in the future. The lessons learned from this moment became a guiding force for the administration's approach to both domestic and foreign policy. As the president addressed the nation one last time regarding the crisis, they reflected on the nature of leadership. "We face an uncertain moment," the president said, But we did not face it alone. Together, we moved through the storm not by perfect decisions, but by taking responsibility and acting when the nation needed us most. Leadership is not just about making the right decisions. It's about having the courage to make decisions when no one knows what the right answer is. It's about seeing the bigger picture and understanding that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, we must move forward. The president's words resonated across the country. Solidify their legacy as a leader who navigated uncertainty with conviction, resilience, and foresight. It was not a perfect journey, but it was one that demonstrated what it truly meant to lead in a time of crisis by making the difficult decisions, standing by them, and working tirelessly to turn challenges into opportunities. The president's legacy, built on this defining crisis, was not just about how they handled the immediate threat, but about how they helped guide the nation toward a more stable, united future. The decision, though fraught with risks, ultimately proved to be the defining moment that defined their leadership for generations to come. So, what do you think? Did the president's leadership define their legacy in this moment? Or did the aftermath reveal the true extent of the challenges they would face in the years ahead?